Ted, why so down?
It's my monsters.
Well, what's wrong with your monsters, man?
They just don't feel special anymore.
Oh, that's something we could talk about.
Hey, that reminds me of a video that I saw from Zee Bashew.
Oh, video response time?
Okay, let's talk about D&D Monsters Witcher style. Video response to Zee Bashew.
Welcome to Nerdarchy. For nerds, by nerds. I'm Nerdarchy Steve, and as usual, I'm hanging out with this nerd.
Nerdarchist Ted.
Hey, if you like videos about D&D, hit that subscribe button.
Don't forget to click that notification bell so those videos don't just slip by.
All right, before we jump into the meat and potatoes of this video, let's give a quick shout out to our sponsor. Let's thank Hero Forge 2.0 on Kickstarter right now, probably over $2 million as we speak. This thing is insane!
They've unlocked so much awesome content within this, and that just so shows how much power this Kickstarter is bringing. I've gotten to see the work firsthand, so we know how cool it is.
But what is it about, Ted?
Hero Forge 2.0 is color 3D printed minis. No more unpainted minis in your collection if you're going to order color printed minis from Hero Forge.
They look fantastic. Now, if you're an expert mini painter like Ted here, it's probably not that big a deal. But for a knucklehead like me that can't paint to save my lives, I end up with more paint on myself than on the mini. This is a godsend. I can now have my own custom minis, and I don't have to stress out about it being painted or not, or finding a professional painter to paint them and possibly spending hundreds of dollars on that. You can get it all done in one place. There will be a link in the description below.
Speaking of that description, there's also going to be a link to the original video by Zee Bashew that talks about what we're going to talk about, because this is a video response.
Making enemies in 5e Witchery.
So the concept is to make the monster have more lore and tying that lore to mechanical benefits, flaws, what have you, so that it becomes more enjoyable. If you play a lot of these different style video games, you know that there are ways to lure monsters out, to have to deal with their resistances and immunities, but to also seek out some kind of vulnerability. So each monster that is a serious threat to what's going on winds up becoming a puzzle in and of itself that the player character or characters get to overcome to make that fight more memorable and more meaningful.
Now, in his video, Zee basically says, hey, you can just tell the players it's X kind of monster. You know about monsters, and you know this is how you're going to have to beat this monster. So if they don't have those capabilities, they might have to figure it out. Or the other option is just go out and you're going to have to kind of like find a lure and figure out how it works. So both of those are cool. So his concept is to take a monster that is significantly higher CR rating, higher challenge than the party is used to or capable of handling, halving their hit points, and then stacking on immunities and resistances, making the monster extra tough, but not having like the normal amount of hit points, because that would just be overkill.
But it would absolutely have to have a vulnerability as well, so that the players have that puzzle to figure out. So you've got this thing that's going to be able to hit harder and typically take more damage than the party is used to dishing out. Well, we have the hit points, lowering some of that threshold, adding a vulnerability, again lowering that threshold, but increasing resistances and immunities. If you don't know what they're all resistant and immune to, some of that damage you're doing is just going to go away. But again, that is something mitigated by putting out a lure, allowing the party to get that ambush.
If he talks about using lures and bait and stuff like that in order to kind of outsmart the monster. But and when we say vulnerabilities, it's not just the mechanical vulnerability, and it's just not your standard vulnerabilities of damage types. That is one way of going about it. And having one of those could be really good, really impactful. You have to be careful because, as he says, this is very weighted towards spellcasters. If you're like, oh, it's just vulnerable to this one energy type, well, then your fighters and your barbarians, they don't have a lot of options in order to counter that. But then he talks about a whole nother level of vulnerabilities where it's specific. Maybe he uses
a blade coated in hen's blood, or a weapon that's been buried underground for 10 years in a grave. These kinds of things. He talks about them being meaningful and impactful and requiring a bit of work. But be careful with those, because those are harder to pull off. And if that is the specific requirement for every one of these creatures, it can get a little old and dry.
Yeah, he threw out, magic by an elf and some other ideas. And also, like, when we get later in the video, this actually inspired something else, and you can draw lots of inspiration from there, because the show, and it has like tons of seasons that you could dip into.
So I really enjoyed, the thematic aspect of this. Zee's videos are fantastic. So there's definitely a lot of stuff to look into. But with this one, I really dig monster lore, and I know there's a lot of D&D players out there who do look and crave for that information. So if you're willing to do this extra bit of work when you're creating a unique monster, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a unique monster, but like, oh, this is a special Umber Hulk or a special Belay that you want to make a change to, okay, great. That particular one is unique. It's got a name, it's got lore, it's got a story that you can then attribute all of this to. Maybe this thing is wreaking havoc across the countryside, and everyone that's gone up against it has either fled or died. No one's been able to take it down. You have to go seeking stories across all of these different towns to find out what has been done to it, what was successful, what failed, just to piece together all of these little clues. That's your puzzle to actually be able to fight it.
Also, you can also incorporate some moral quandaries as well. One being the stuff that you have to use for the vulnerabilities. The other thing is your monster bait. I don't like to use the word lure, because we're also saying lure, so that it gets confusing. But like your monster bait, maybe if it, this particular monster is only attracted to children, so do you put a child out there to bait the monster to come out there? Do you endanger a child, or could be something like a virgin or someone who's never been kissed. You can get kind of weird with it if you want,
depending upon what kind of themes and avenues that you're willing to go with in your games. And as always, make sure that your party is okay with these kinds of content. Have a session 0 and talk about it if you want to broach those kinds of subjects and themes.
Now, like I said, this makes me think of this show, the TV show Supernatural, right? The Winchester brothers, and it's very formulaic. So monster attacks. So now there's a mystery. They figure out what the attack's happening, what's going on. They're always scouring for weird stuff, and then they consult the lore to figure out, like we said, what kind of monster was it? How do you defeat it? What are their weaknesses? What are their strengths? And then the ultimate climax of it all is they resolve the problem with the monster and take them out. So in supernatural world, dead man's blood is poison for vampires. So they have to find a place to get that oftentimes. And that can also be a moral quandary too. Like, where do you go to find that? Do you make someone dead to get the blood? Where do you go to hang out? In medieval times, it's a little bit harder, right? In modern times, you go like to the morgue or something.
Make a friend with someone in an autopsy and be like, look, I just need a steady stream of this. I'm fighting vampires. They might think you're crazy, but money changes hands. It's all good.
You might need weapons that are silvered or brass, copper, things like that. And by making it things like that too, while it is technically more difficult, all in all, it does give the opportunity for the more martial characters to provide the solution or wield the solution, where when we're just like strictly talking energy types, then it becomes, the wizard's going to just take care of it. Or maybe you do something interesting where it's like their vulnerability is chilled metal, right? So maybe the wizard or the spellcaster has to work with the warrior and chill their weapon before they attack.
Right. So you could do a lot of things to have a combo, especially because you're kind of talking about video gaming D&D. That that could wind up working. And we already have a bit of precedence with, the I want to use the help action, but instead of, giving that person advantage, I want to use my magic and instill cold within his weapon or her weapon, what have you. So you have a lot of things that you can do along those lines. And then if you start doing this kind of style and strategy a lot, it then leads me down the road of, well, when do you do there's this lore here, which is very similar to the lore of this other creature that's less common. So you go into the fight thinking it's going to be monster A, and what you've got, the vulnerability to, it's actually immune to because it's actually creature B. So you've got that, you got to go and flee from the fight because it's not what you were expecting, and then you have to start the puzzle all over again.
Yeah, I mean, stealing even more from, basically folklore as well as, watching Supernatural. You could do things with salt circles where the circle is open, but you use that bait, whether it's a child or whatever you had to use, to get the monster in. Someone swoops in, removes the child. But before the monster can pursue them, they close the circle, so they're trapped. Oftentimes they also use something called a devil's trap for demonic demons and fiends, which was kind of cool, where sometimes it could even be a rug that you have with you that's kind of like you lay out. They're able to go into it, no problem. Maybe it's covered with leaves or something, it's disguised, and then boom, the trap activates, they're stuck. So you can do fun things like that. So it just adds like another layer to the game. And just look up some folklore and you can probably find some really cool things to add to it.
So there is just a lot to get into with skill challenges, skill checks, if you will, and involve them within not only the combat.
Finding of the information.
Finding of the information so that defeating the monster requires a puzzle beforehand and then the actual combat. To me, this seems very exciting. I am intrigued by this, and it makes me, when I begin, designing my own monsters, that I want to work in, things like this because I found that video so inspiring.
Yeah, I mean, you can also do other things that aren't damage per se, but effects. Like, if you use copper pennies, you can now, it's shadow in place, which pins the monster and they can't move. They have the restrained effect. So I feel like you could definitely come up with some interesting and fun things that also other people in the party might be able to do. And maybe it's not directly a damage effect, but overall it helps the party defeat this particular monster.
Inspired by, one of my most recent sessions that I played in, you could have these kind of effects neutralize or debilitate the monster. It could reduce its effectiveness in combat in a number of different ways, depending upon how you want to do it. So beyond a vulnerability mechanically, there are other things mechanically that you can do to a monster and have it be fun.
Well, and also, too, if you do something like that, say, restrains it, or traps it, now you can force an RP, a role play from this encounter, not just a combat.
Correct.
As we said earlier, if you want to check out more of Zee's work or the particular video we talked about, there's a card around here somewheres that you can check out. Making Enemies in 5e Witchery.
If you like custom 5e content, you can always support us over on Patreon, where we make new products every month.
We also do weekly live chats with our patrons, have monthly giveaways that our patrons are automatically entered, and more.
So until next time, stay nerdy.